Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Legal Futures, a review of Disabled and Vulnerable Beneficiary Trust webinar. I am Gill Steel of Law Skills Limited, who will be your presenter for this session. The definition of vulnerable beneficiary includes, for income tax and CGT, disabled persons. However, inheritance tax looks at the issue somewhat differently, having disabled persons interest trusts, where the definition of disabled person fortunately now matches that for income tax and capital gains. But there isn't a vulnerable beneficiary category as such. Instead, for IHT, we have bereaved minor trusts and age 18 to 25 trusts. So, although many of the definitions were aligned following the Finance Act of 2013, they are not identical, and this makes this whole area very confusing. And many of you asked me, what's the benefit of having a disabled person's interest compared to an ordinary discretionary trust? So we'll definitely pick that up as part of this session. Because in this webinar, my aim is to untangle the maze of these different trusts and different types of relief under the income and capital gains tax scheme on the one hand and the inheritance tax scheme on the other. And although it was the object of the legislation in 2013 to bring it all together, the fact remains that there'll be many trusts out there which was set up under the pre-2013 definitions and which therefore might still be a disabled person's interest because of the transitional rules that were given at the time, but they don't benefit from the income tax and capital gains tax concessions. So, as a result of today's webinar, participants who are listening will be able to identify when to make a vulnerable person election for income tax and capital gains, and also be able to distinguish between the disabled person's interests and an ordinary discretionary trust, which I think is pretty important. So I've divided the webinar into 5 parts. First of all, we'll look at who counts as a disabled person for all 3 taxes, income tax, capital gains and inheritance tax. And then we'll look at the income tax and CGT scheme, which is about vulnerable persons and when you should make a vulnerable person election. And then we'll switch taxes and go to the inheritance tax side and look at the different types of disabled persons' interests. And then we'll weigh up the pros and cons of whether you go for a DPI or an ordinary plain vanilla discretionary trust.